Good morning, everybody. Lovely to see you here, and thank you very much for joining. So, this is an exciting session. I've been looking forward to this one. We've got a lot of people registered, so I'm hoping that there will be a few kind of interesting conversations and a few interesting topics. It's certainly something that has come up quite a lot on the HR Ninjas forum. So I think there hopefully will be some interesting kind of learnings from today's session. Maybe a few kind of opposing opinions, maybe a few different suggestions of things you might want to consider, and maybe possibly just some validation of some things that you're already doing as well. Um, there's a lot to go through, so I'm just going to get cracking. Today's session is recorded, like they all are. So if you need to leave early, or if we overrun, or if you just want to go back and recap on anything, we will publish the recording of this. So don't panic too much if you've got other things to do, or you're only half listening or anything like that. We will also, as we go along, I'm going to try and keep a bit of half an eye on the chat and the Q&A section, but we'll also go through that together at the end. So if you've got any questions or anything that you would like to cover, or just any opinions you'd like to share or anything like that, please do stick them in the chat, and I'll do my best to run through them at the end. We may end up running over time if there's a lot of them, but that's absolutely fine. I would rather kind of try and address any questions that you may have whilst we're all here. So please do use that chat feature. It's okay just to post stuff as you go along as well, and I'll come to it at the end if that's okay. Just a basic bit of housekeeping on top of that as well. I'm very aware that some of the topics that we talk about today are a little bit contentious. There have been some quite strong opinions on the Facebook forum. Some of those opinions, without doubt, will be contrary to some of the things that we talk about in today's session. That's fine. That's great. It's always good to see differing opinions. What I would say is, if we can just kind of try and keep things fairly open-minded, and anything that you kind of disagree with, that's absolutely fine. I'd love to hear kind of why you disagree with it, and anything that you might be doing differently. Um, yeah, that's it really. So anything that you kind of do want to share, please do let me know. If there's anything that you kind of consider to be contentious, or anything like that, would love to discuss it. Obviously, we'll try and do so respectfully, but we'll try and discuss it, and maybe see if there's an alternative view on matters as well. Anyway, without further ado, let's get cracking because there's a lot to go through. So, what we're actually talking about today, what you on about, Harry? Well, as you've seen from the title of this, we're talking about what we at Smart Clinic call pre-placement screening. You will have many different names for it. Lots of people call it lots of different things. Some of you might know them as pre-starter health questionnaires, pre-employment questionnaires, pre-placement questionnaires, pre-employment screenings, medical screenings, all sorts of different things. They're basically all the same thing. Um, but ultimately, what we're talking about is any kind of um, medical or clinical check that you're doing on an employee prior to them commencing in their new role, or in the early stages of them commencing in their new role. It's essentially something along the lines of, are they fit to do the new role? Are there any adjustments that this employee may need? Is there any support that they may need? Is there anything that we can do to help them in their new role? Really, that is what we're talking about today. There's lots of, as I say, there's lots of different names for it, and there's lots of different lingos. So I might kind of use some of the expressions interchangeably, but ultimately that's what we're talking about. And they kind of serve two core purposes. And most of you on here, if you're considering or currently doing anything along these lines, generally it will be really to achieve these two things. It's firstly to ascertain, are they actually fit for their new role? So are they able to do their new role from a medical perspective? And secondly, do they need any support or any adjustments to work in that role? Now, it's important to kind of hone in on the fact that those two are the primary, if not the only, purposes of this. We're not looking, and nor should you, we're not looking for an exhaustive list of all somebody's medical history. We're not looking for a report We don't want to be providing you as an organisation or you as an HR department a report listing every medical condition an employee has ever had. That's definitely not what the purpose of something like this, which is, I know I'm stating the obvious here, but actually is going to be something that we probably revisit when we kind of talk about how we're going to be best achieving this throughout this session today. So it is quite relevant that, even though it's a fairly obvious thing to say. Why? Why do we actually want to be doing this? Why do we want to be doing some kind of pre-placement screening for a new starter? Well, again, there's kind of four primary criteria or purposes. One of them, of course, is your health and safety legislation. We all know about things like the Health and Safety at Work Act, for example. One of them is also to ensure you're fulfilling your obligations under the Equality Act. As we all know, and as we've covered in many of our other sessions, if somebody has a disability that's covered under the Equality Act, you as an employer have an obligation to put in reasonable adjustments. That obligation begins on day one, not when it becomes apparent to you. That obligation is a day one obligation for you as an employer. So really the only way that you're going to be able to know this or be able to manage under the Equality Act is to get that support and get that information and get that advice from day one, or at least in the early days. It means that you as an employer, you're also fulfilling your duty of care. We all know that as employers, we have, to an extent, we have a duty of care over our employees. So if we make sure that we're kind of giving them the support that they need from day one, then we're fulfilling our duty of care from day one. And of course, from a slightly more pragmatic point of view, and probably from a more commercial point of view, we also want to be managing absences moving forwards as well. If an employee has an underlying medical condition that possibly means that they're at greater risk of absence or greater risk of, any kind of clinical issues impacting on their work, then you obviously want to be managing that going forward, whether that's doing things like adjusting your Bradford factor scores or your trigger points or giving them the support that they need or giving them a bit of flexibility at work or whatever it could be. So that's generally the purposes of these things. You may also have additional kind of purposes or motivations for doing something similar as well. But they're the four most common ones that I tend to encounter as I speak with our clients. I recognise a few of you on this call, by the way, as well. I know a few of you on this call today are clients, so a big hello to you guys too. So, okay, that's the purpose of it, and that's what we're looking to achieve. Do we actually need to do this? Well, to be perfectly blunt about it, legally, the answer is no. You don't have to do that. There is no black and white law that says you must do a pre-placement screening or a pre-employment health check or something. There are one or two exceptions to that, I hasten to add, but for the sake of simplicity, the answer to that is no. You don't legally have to do this. However, as with anything in all of employment, there is an asterisk there. The reason for that is, and it's very frustrating, and I don't envy you guys in your role, but unfortunately, most of employment law is not common law. It's not written in black and white. Most employment law is actually what's called case law, which means we have to wait until things happen and then learn from rulings. Obviously, within the HR context, most rulings come from employment tribunals. Not all of them. Some of them will be other kind of legal disputes and court cases and things, but the majority of them will be employment tribunals and employment appeal tribunals, EATs. So most of our learnings need to come from employment tribunals. Now, interestingly, I was actually on a webinar myself the other day with a barrister who focuses primarily on occupational health cases, and she actually said even sometimes employment tribunals get it wrong and misinterpret the law. So that makes it even more complicated for you guys. But ultimately, I think if we generally use guidance from employment tribunals and rulings, then it sets us in the right direction. And that will be invariably how the majority of you guys have developed your best practices as you've gone along. You will have focused just on some common law, some black and white legislation, for example, things like the Data Protection Act. But you also will have focused on some case law as well. So things that have helped to advise your best practices. And we will talk about both of these as we go along. We'll talk about both common law and case law as we go along. Ultimately, there is no common law that says you need to do this. There is, however, lots of case law. There's lots of case law about how employees should be managing disabilities. So employers, I should say, should be managing employees with disabilities. Um, there's lots of case law around kind of what adjustments they should or shouldn't be implementing. There's lots of case law around appropriate conversations to have and where conversations might actually become inappropriate and how it might constitute discrimination. And I'm not just talking about disability discrimination here. It could be things like age discrimination, sex discrimination. For example, if you're having inappropriate conversations about the menopause, for instance, that would also constitute sex discrimination, just as an example. So these are all the things that we need to consider. So just to go back to the basic answer to this, do we need to do this? No. Is it best practice to do it? Yes. So from here on in, you might have got to this stage and said, well, okay, if from an absolute black and white technical point of view, we don't need to do this, fine, we won't bother. That's okay. You might well have come to that conclusion. And if that's the conclusion you've come to, you can switch off now, really. We're probably not going to be kind of the webinar for you any further. If you are intrigued and think maybe we should be doing this and maybe this is something that we want to do, or we are currently doing it but would possibly like to look at the ways of improving it, the rest of this session definitely is for you. So how are we going to implement this? We've decided that we do want to do some kind of pre-employment screening. So how are we going to do it? Well, ultimately, there's three common takes on how you might be doing some kind of pre-employment health check. Firstly, you can just let an employee self-declare. That might come in the form of some kind of tick box that you do when somebody starts that says, are you aware of any medical conditions that you have that might impact on your ability to work? Yes or no? That could be something along those lines. You might do it internally. So you might ask the medical questions yourselves internally. And then you make the determination and the decision about whether someone's fit for the job or whether they need any adjustments or not. Or the third common approach is use occupational health to do it, and effectively you don't really get involved in it at all. I'm not at this stage saying that any of those are right or wrong, although we will explore some of the kind of common pitfalls about some of these things as we go along. But really, for now, the question is, which one are you going to do? Assuming that you want to do some kind of pre-employment health check, which of these are you going to do? Well, let's look at this. And we're going to look at this with two hats on. We'll go through each one separately, but we're going to look at it with two hats on. We're looking firstly at the clinical need of the employee. So that's things about their medical condition and if they have one, their clinical ability to work and so on. And we're also going to look at things with our data protection hats on. Now, I'm well aware that you guys in HR, you've got an awful lot of things on your plate, but you're not probably data protection experts and you're not probably medical experts. In other words, you probably aren't the data protection officer and you probably aren't a doctor. There might be one or two instances in which I'm wrong there, but as the vast majority of time, you're not either of those two things. You're HR personnel. You specialize in all things human resources related and personnel related and people related. So these are probably two things that might be semi-familiar with you, but not totally familiar with you, which is why I've focused some of this webinar on these 2 points, because I think these are the 2 points where really we can probably learn the most, or hopefully you guys can kind of explore most topics that you might be less familiar with anyway. In other words, trying to make it as helpful as I can for you. So firstly, let's look at it from a clinical point of view. And by clinical, we're talking about kind of the needs of the employee from a medical perspective. So from this point of view, whatever it is that you're doing, whatever process you're following, we're looking at the employee's medical background. Because we're looking at the employee's medical background, we're going to be asking medical questions, and the employee is going to be giving medical responses. Now, they may be very directly medical questions, things like what medication are you on? They might be very indirectly medical questions like, do you need any support at work? Either way, they have medical contexts associated to them. Because they have medical context associated to them, the questions should be written and asked by someone with clinical training. In other words, a doctor, a nurse, maybe a psychologist, maybe a physiotherapist, but certainly somebody with medical training. This is probably our first contentious issue. There will be undoubtedly, of the 20 or 30 people on this webinar, there will be people who already are disagreeing with me here, who say, no, they don't need to be. We're perfectly capable of asking medical questions ourselves. Why have you said it needs to be a clinician? Well, here's why. As we've said, the questions that we're asking are medical, but those questions do also need to be relevant to the job role. So they are sort of medico-legal questions, they are medico-employment questions. In other words, they're occupational health questions. They're questions about health, but they're also questions about their occupation. Those questions will generally vary by job role. They will probably vary by risk. They will probably vary by um, I mean, a good questionnaire should be dynamic, so it should vary according to what the answer to the previous question was, for instance. Um, it will also vary by kind of legal requirements as well. To give you an example, a teacher should be asked, Scott, sorry, start that again. A teacher should be being asked different questions to a warehouse worker, for example. A warehouse worker may well be a forklift truck driver. There may be safety critical elements of their role. There may be questions about eyesight, for example. A teacher, by contrast, they have what's called fitness to teach guidelines, which is a set of medical criteria that determines whether somebody is fit to work with students. A lot of it is safeguarding principles, for instance. Different sets of questions, different employment contexts. Similarly, as well as the questions being medical, the answers will also be medical. Obviously, what answer is elicited will depend on what question is being asked, but generally they will have some form of medical context to them, if not being fully medical. Because they are medical answers, and until you get that answer, you don't know what the answer is going to be. There will be a degree of interpretation that needs to happen. That interpretation could be, well, what does this health condition mean? What are the symptoms of it? How would it be managed? What medication would they be on? What treatment might they be on? What are the symptoms of it? And so on. Now, it's somebody really with medical training that needs to assess that because of that interpretation. I'll give you an example. If you're asking somebody about their medical history and they declare to you that they take 60 milligrams of olanzapine, that's fine. That's a very personal matter to them. So it might be something you're not necessarily comfortable knowing, but they might tell you anyway. Next up, I'm going to assume you're going to Google what olanzapine is. Well, olanzapine is it's a medicine that people will take to manage symptoms of nausea and vomiting when they're undergoing chemotherapy. It's also an antipsychotic medication to limit hallucinations and hearing voices for people that are suffering from paranoid schizophrenia. That's not something you would want to get wrong. You would not want to get that mixed up, would you? So it can be very easy to misinterpret medical information. It can be very easy to make assumptions and actually come to the wrong assumptions. That's perfectly understandable. It's not your job. You're not a doctor. You're not a nurse. It's not your job to know what olanzapine is. It's not your job to know what is a common medication that will get prescribed for nausea and vomiting during chemotherapy, for example. But it is a doctor's job and it is a nurse's job to know those things. That's what they're trained in. Also, thinking of the employee themselves, it's generally just more appropriate for them to be having a medical conversation with a medical professional. Just think of it in layman's terms. If you're at work and somebody walked up to you and asked you whether you suffer from depression, would you feel comfortable or would you feel a little bit, put out that conversation with you? If the answer is no, you wouldn't feel comfortable, then why would that be any different on a form or a questionnaire? Same goes with lots of personal things. If your line manager asked you if you had an eating disorder, is that something that might make you feel uncomfortable? It is me. I definitely wouldn't want to be having that conversation with a line manager. I would, however, be happy having that conversation with my GP or, somebody who's clinically trained but separate to the organisation I work for. Um, There's also a possibility, and I think we've got to be quite honest with ourselves about this. There's also a possibility where if a colleague or a line manager asks me about my medical history, I might not be 100% honest with them because I might not actually be comfortable having that conversation with them. So I might choose not to declare the fact that I've suffered from general anxiety disorder in the past, or that I'm currently on 20 milligrams of sertraline, or or something to that effect. It's not necessarily something I'd be willing to have an open conversation about. I mean, some people might, don't get me wrong, some people absolutely might, but certainly some people might not too. Um, so again, considering kind of the clinical needs of an employee, it's really kind of a consideration as to how comfortable they would feel having that conversation with a non-medical um, person, somebody in HR, for example. There's also further advice and further recommendations and suggestions that could be useful. To go back to this person who's suffering from nausea and vomiting because they're undergoing chemotherapy, there might be some advice that can be given to that employee. Is the olanzapine working? Well, if not, maybe a clinician can actually give them some advice on other things that could work, some other medications to try. Perhaps they might recommend that they go back to their GP to ask for a different type of medication. Perhaps they might have some well-being tips that they could do to help manage the nausea and vomiting. For example, taking the medication at a different time of day or adjusting their diet, or if they're a smoker, perhaps adjusting their smoking routine, or whatever it could be. There is clinical advice that could be given to an employee that might actually improve upon their ability to work normally, and therefore obviously commercially improve on their output at work as well. These are all things that an HR person could never possibly be expected to know or be expected to advise on because it's just not within their remit, but it certainly is within the remit of a clinician. So that's just some of the kind of clinical focuses. We're also going to have sort of 5 minutes now talking about our least favorite topic of all, generally, which is data protection. There's a lot of data protection considerations here. Um, well, I think I might have skipped a slide. Either that or I've accidentally deleted the slide. Yeah, no, I've accidentally deleted the slide here. Apologies. But from a data protection point of view, the second that you ask a medical question and get a medical response, you're a data controller for that medical information. Apologies, this should be on a slide and it's not, but I can explain it anyway. You're now a data controller for this medical data of this employee. That means you need to have all of the considerations that come with being a data controller of medical information. It means, for example, that you need to justify the processing of that information, and that needs to be documented. You need to have a retention schedule for that data, and that retention schedule will probably be different from the other data that you hold. Typically, for example, data retention schedules for medical data are the length of somebody's contract plus 6 years. That will unlikely be the retention schedule for some of your other information, like payroll information, for instance. So you need to handle that data differently. You would need to identify lawful basis of processing for that data, whether it's consent or employment law or whatever it could be. Ultimately, there's a lot of data protection considerations that you need to do, and you need to go through quite a lengthy process of documenting all of that. Not fun, but it needs to be done. Them's the rules, I'm afraid. There's also a data protection consideration, which is a phenomenon known as the imbalance of power. Um, and this is a particularly common phenomenon when it comes to a new starter, because generally new starters want to be compliant. They don't want to cause a problem before they've even began working with you. They'll be much less willing to raise issues than somebody who's maybe been employed for 2 years, for example, that knows that they're beyond the period of time where they can be dismissed without being able to make a constructive dismissal claim, for example. I appreciate the laws around that are changing. Um, Either way, an employee who's a new starter is ultimately not holding the cards in terms of power. The employer usually is holding the cards at this time. So they're going to be fairly unwilling to cause a difficulty. They're going to be fairly unwilling to kind of declare that they need any help with something relative to somebody that might have worked for you for a number of years. It's quite an important consideration that when it comes to um, well, I mean, when it comes to case law, but also just when it comes to kind of fairness of processing, it's something that actually gets reflected upon and argued about in law quite a lot, is the imbalance of power. It's not enough just to say these are the rules, do it. There's also needs to be a consideration as to whether that doing it is fair, and whether somebody kind of has too much power over the other person and therefore is forcing them to process information, such as kind of answering questionnaires, for instance. The ICO, very fortunately for all of us, published some very direct guidance about this in August 2023. The link to the guidance has changed, but it's still there, and actually the guidance itself gets updated periodically. But if you just Google ICO employers information about health, or something along those lines, it'll be the top article that you find. But it's an ICO guidance. It's very, very long. It's very detailed, actually. It's really helpful. And it gives some fantastic examples. The next 2 or 3 slides, I've just quoted a few kind of relevant bits of this guidance that would be something that you would need to consider if you are gathering the medical information yourselves, as opposed to outsourcing it to occupational health. If you want to collect and use information on your workers' health, you must be clear about why you're doing so. We've talked about that a little bit. It's called a lawful basis of processing information. You need to be transparent about that as well, and you need to document it all. You must be clear and transparent about your purposes for processing health information from the start. Now, this is an interesting one because we're talking about purposes. Now, it's clear what the purpose is for assessing whether somebody's fit to commence in their role. It's clear what the purpose is for identifying whether somebody needs support or not. It's less clear what the purpose is for asking them what medication they're on, or whether they've ever suffered from a mental health condition, or whether they've ever had cancer, or whether they suffer from migraines, or something along those lines. Because actually, you're not really asking those questions. You're asking whether they need any help at work. You're not asking about whether they suffer from migraines, for instance. So the purpose of processing that information becomes a little bit obfuscated if you're doing medical questionnaires yourself. You may find it difficult to rely on consent to process health information about your workers. This is because, as an employer, you will generally be in a position of power over your workers. Okay, here we go. So we're talking again about this imbalance of power. I mentioned earlier that you always need a lawful basis to process information. Now, consent is one of those, but already the ICO has said, well, that's not enough, I'm afraid, because as an employer, there's an imbalance of power. So consent isn't really freely given. So actually, you need to be identifying other lawful kind of basis for processing information. We also kind of need to consider. No, there's another slide missing here, which is a really important slide. That's such a shame that this isn't here. I will make sure it's shared within the recording that we send out. But the ICO actually specifically gives the example of an employer who does a pre-employment questionnaire. And the ICO guidance on this is very, very clear. It's very black and white. The guidance is that any medical questionnaires should be written and distributed by a medical practitioner, and the responses should be sent back to a medical practitioner. So that is, from the ICO's point of view, very clear. Now, the ICO, they are a guidance organisation. They don't make the law, but they are in charge of making sure that the law gets applied appropriately. So if you ever had any data protection complaints, it would be the ICO who would investigate those complaints. So in this context, for example, the first thing that they would say is, has the information been sent by a medical practitioner? Has it been received by a medical practitioner? Has it been assessed by a medical practitioner? If the answer is yes, great. If the answer is no, they would definitely, without a doubt, have something to say about it. So I mentioned a little bit earlier that we generally kind of take guidance from case law and tribunals. I also mentioned that it's not exclusively tribunals, there are just legal cases as well. There is one very sad but very famous legal case on this slide. So employers should make reasonable endeavours to find out about an employee's disability or the specific disadvantage suffered. Case law loves the word reasonable, doesn't it? It always makes it difficult for employers. I know it does. It is a challenge, but reasonable endeavours, what does that mean? That means that you need to do what you can to investigate whether an employee has a disability and whether there's anything that you need to do to overcome that disadvantage. Now, note that's not specifically saying that you need to do a pre-placement questionnaire, but it is saying that you need to make endeavours to support an employee. Um, Likewise, as we all know, under the Equality Act, if somebody is covered, then as an employer, you need to make reasonable adjustments. That doesn't mean to say that you need to make all adjustments, but you do need to make reasonable adjustments. Now, this third one, this is a very sad instance. I'm sure many of you will remember this, but there was the Glasgow bin lorry crash. Just to give a very brief summary for those of you who don't remember this or kind of were a bit younger at the time, this was an instance where a bin lorry driver suffered from a seizure and drove into a crowd. It killed 6 people and it seriously harmed quite a number of other people. I think it was 6. It was a very sad state of affairs, but it changed the landscape for occupational health quite a lot because actually it later transpired in the 2014 investigation that the individual had a history of seizures and blackouts. I think it was forgive me, I actually think it was blackouts rather than seizures. But either way, he had a history of blackouts that actually would have rendered him not safe to drive had appropriate investigations have taken place at the time. Now, obviously, that would have saved some very unfortunate consequences, but it also left the employer liable for not having done what they should have done in terms of assessing whether that lorry driver was fit to drive that lorry. Um, and and this one's very significant. An employer should not rely on their own interpretation of medical history, for example, test results, diagnoses, medication, and so on. They should assess how this may impact their ability to work. So that is a very different thing. But an employer shouldn't be interpreting medical information. They should be asking occupational health to do that for them. That is the very purpose of occupational health. This was an employment tribunal, and it was between the police and a lady called Lisa Coffey in 2019. It was quite a significant case. So if you add all of these things up, it's quite possible that the conclusion that you're coming to is that it's very important to do some kind of pre-employment screening, but it's not necessarily something that you should be doing yourselves since you're not medical professionals. Therefore, the answer will often be that you will ask a medical professional to do this for you. Now, some of you might have that in-house already. That's great. Perhaps that is the answer. Most of you probably won't have that in-house, and therefore the obvious option to you is to use an occupational health company. If you use us, we have a service called a pre-placement screening, but pretty much every occupational health provider that exists will have something similar. So if we're not your provider and you're not doing this, go ask them, go get some pricing. If they don't give you direct pricing, or if you just want a second opinion on it, by all means contact me about it as well. I'll be more than happy to kind of give you a bit more information about how our service looks. It's something that we talk about quite frequently on the Facebook forum, the HR Ninjas forum, and it's something that I've seen crop up quite a lot, and I've seen people kind of give some objections. Now, I've put 4 common objections that I've observed on the Facebook forum up on this screen here. I have changed the wording of it just to preserve the anonymity of anyone who's made such comments. But loosely speaking, these are kind of some 4 common objections that I've seen. The first is that they can't afford it. Can't speak for other occupational health providers. Our service costs £30. There's no additional charge if an employment is required. So it is a £30 grand total fee. To state the obvious, £30 is an awful lot cheaper than an employment tribunal or an employee who doesn't work out, who needs re-recruiting, or somebody who has a very high level of absence on the basis of a medical condition. So I think it'll be difficult to argue that you couldn't afford £30 as part of a new hire. I appreciate that is only our pricing. I can't speak for other providers there. The employee knows what they need better than anyone. I've seen this crop up a lot. This is a common comment. And there is an element of truth to this. The employee does know their symptoms better. They do know their medical background better, and they probably do know what they can do to self-manage a lot of the time. However, they also don't necessarily know the intricacies of the job role as well as you do. They probably don't know the law as well. They probably don't know what adjustments will or won't be available within your organization. They probably won't know what some of the pressure points of their new job role could be. Um, and they also don't necessarily know what adjustments in a professional context might help them to remain kind of at work a little bit better. There is also a mixed motivation here. Um, you know, I've mentioned earlier, an employee might be unwilling to be difficult at this stage, so they might be unwilling to ask for adjustments in the early stages. Similarly, they might particularly want an adjustment that actually they don't necessarily need. They might ask for something that they don't need. Common ones, of course, are working from home, comfier chairs, expensive headphones, things like that. It could be that that will be a nice to have, but it's not necessarily something that they medically need. Either way, getting an independent assessment of that by somebody who's got training in occupational medicine is going to make sure that their symptoms and their health condition and your professional requirements and your organizational structure match each other well. Um, we don't need to refer anyone, only those we're worried about. Again, there could be an element of truth here. It could be that you make that decision. That's fine. That's not wrong. But it also obviously runs a very high risk of something being missed. It runs a high risk of somebody's not declaring something that they possibly should have declared because they didn't feel comfortable speaking up because it's only day one. You might not necessarily have cause to worry about somebody. As we've seen from earlier, you still need to make reasonable endeavours to make sure that that person is fit to do their work and reasonable endeavours to see whether they need any adjustments or any support at work as well. And then finally, it's not necessary to us. All of our roles are low risk in our organisation. Again, that could be true, that could not be true. I don't think there is any such thing as a role that somebody would always be fit for. Everybody gets ill. Everybody has medical conditions. At some point or another, every single one of us will be unable to work for medical reasons, irrespective of what our role is. Some roles are very sedentary, and therefore musculoskeletal conditions might be a bit less relevant in terms of impacting upon their ability to work because they're sat down, for instance. They might have high levels of stress associated to them. Perhaps you're sat down all day, but you deal with complaints or you deal with stressful situations, for example. Perhaps it's exactly the opposite. Perhaps you don't deal with complaints at all, but you're a bricklayer. So it's a very physically demanding job. I don't think there is any such thing as a role that is so low risk that somebody is indefinitely fit to be able to do it, though. I think there will always be medical considerations for all of us. So that's just a little bit of feedback, a little bit of input. I'd be really fascinated to kind of hear any of your thoughts on this. Any kind of common question, not common questions, any questions that you may have, perhaps any opposing views that you may have. It might well be that you think completely disagree with everything you've said, Harry. It's absolutely fine to do a questionnaire in-house and it will be the best way of doing it. That's perfectly fine. I would again be very, very interested to hear that and understand kind of why you've come to that conclusion. But hopefully that gives you a little bit of kind of food for thought. I've very much tried to not make this just a 30-minute selling session because it really isn't about that. It's about making sure that you're kind of doing what suits your organization best. So I kind of hope that helps, and I hope that feels transparent and doesn't feel like we're just kind of shamelessly plugging our services because we're not. And I'm very well aware that some of you guys actually won't be using us anyway. You'll be using other OH providers, which is also absolutely fine. Okay, right. I'm just going to jump to the Q&A section. Please do, sorry, the chat section. I mean, please do add anything to this that you think would be relevant or you might like us to go through. But just bear with me while I have a quick read of this. What's the cost of that pre-placement screening? £30. And that includes an appointment. Just by the way, this is a little bit of a tip when it comes to asking your occupational health provider. Most providers will charge a fee for the questionnaire and then a separate fee for the appointment. So it might be that the questionnaire is only 10 quid or something like that, but a follow-up appointment's like £90 or something like that. Just be aware of that when it comes to assessing your cost. We don't structure our prices that way, incidentally. Our price is £30 for everything. Um, but yeah, anyway, just a tip in terms of if you're not using Smart Clinic as your provider. Do employment checks that are £30 include assessment of reasonable adjustments, or would this be an additional cost? Yes, they do. They do include that. That is exactly what the purpose of this is for. The occupational health are there to assess what the impact of somebody's health condition is on their ability to work. Now, part of assessing that impact is also assessing what conditions would need to be true in order for that person to be fit for work. That is a reasonable adjustment. So let's say hypothetically that an individual is fit for work, but that they would only be fit to work for 7 hours a day, not 8 hours a day, for example. That might be a reasonable adjustment that you guys would wish to consider. Therefore, that is something that occupational health would advise you upon as part of a pre-placement screening or a pre-employment check. That basically is the purpose of it, to be honest. I think when we were right at the beginning, we mentioned there's kind of two purposes. One of them is to assess whether they're fit for the new role. The second of them is to determine what support and adjustments they would need as part of that new role. You've mentioned there that referring to access to work to understand adjustments is something that you do. Generally, access to work are the doers rather than the advisors. So it might be, for instance, that one of the adjustments was that they needed some piece of software, maybe a dictation software or an additional screen, or some piece of hardware, for instance. Um, Access to work would be the people who would supply that and supply the funding for that. They would not necessarily be the people who would do the initial assessment. Even if they did do the initial assessment, you're probably going to be waiting like 6 months for that, or several months for that. It's not occupational health. It's a different thing. Hopefully that answers your question, Natalie. Um, Georgina is on a basic Otter plan. I don't think that's a question. I think that might be AI. We also have Otter AI. It's brilliant. It would be interesting to hear how other people manage health conditions declared that would massively impact their role, such as asthma, where we recruit welders. It would be interesting. Yeah, it would be interesting to hear that. That's really a question for the floor, I think. Is there anyone else who would have any kind of anything to add to the chat in that regard? I mean, somebody who has asthma who's a welder, for example, clearly there's going to be an element of PPE involved in that. There might be, some extra ventilation, for instance, that needs to be implemented. There's all sorts of things, but I would also be interested to hear what other people are doing about that. Jamie, so is a pre-placement report received? Yes. Yes, you would receive a report. That is exactly what the service is. That's what you're paying for. Natalie, again, we have a number of people with conditions who've declared this through their pre-employment declarations, which we as a people team do. We do refer to OH if we need to understand more about their condition, but some of those people have been working for years with agreed adjustments. Would you suggest we do checks with OH now with those people? Good question. No, the horse has bolted in that regard. I think doing it for a new starter, very important. For somebody who has already declared a health condition to you and you now have observed that that condition may or may not be impacting on their ability to work, and you need further advice on that, that's what an occupational health assessment is for. That's a different thing. That's we're no longer talking about new starters at that stage. Definitely yes. Make a referral to occupational health. You don't need to refer everyone with every medical condition that's ever existed. That will cost you far too much money and frankly cause you more problems than it's resolving. You're just making work for yourself there. But if there's a suspicion that their health condition might be impacting upon their work in some way, or could in the future impact on their work in some way, then yes, it's probably prudent to get occupational health advice for some of the reasons that we've talked about. There is also a previous seminar that we've done with HR Ninjas that goes into that topic in more detail as well. So if you have a flick through some of the other ones of these we've done, Natalie, that will give you a 30-minute answer to that question rather than a 20-second one that I've just given you. Helen, we send out pre-employment questionnaires ourselves, which is not intrusive and mostly asks things like any physical or mental impairment which has a substantial long-term effect on your ability to carry out day-to-day activities. Okay, so you've used the wording there from the Equality Act itself to ask the question. If yes, please specify. If the individual says yes, then I refer to OH. Okay, yeah, so that was the middle ground that we were talking about earlier, where we were talking about there's kind of three options that some employers would consider. One of them is asking the employee to make the decision. One of them is making the decision yourselves. One of them is asking OH to make the decision. This one that you've done here, Helen, is you're asking the employee to make the decision themselves. You're not necessarily wrong to do that. We have talked about some of the common pitfalls of doing that as part of this consultation. The imbalance of power is an example of that. Also, the fact that they're not clinically trained, so they don't necessarily know what what impact it may have is obviously another one. But yes, I mean, it is a common approach what you're doing there, Helen. It's not necessarily the best advised one, but it is certainly an approach, and it's something that I do hear quite frequently. Let me just read the rest of what you've said, Helen. If the individual says yes, then I refer to H, or another question says, are you taking medication? Again, if the answer is yes, are they comfortable to disclose? Okay, be careful there. And if not, or if yes to both, we refer to OH. We don't ask intrusive medical questions, and any yes that sounds like we need more information, an OH referral is made. This sounds like the ICO still wouldn't like it. No, the ICO wouldn't like it. And you have actually there asked if they would be comfortable to disclose their medication, which we've talked about. They may well feel like they should be disclosing their medication, in which case you now know that that person is on sertraline or olanzapine or any other kind of common medication. They also would, the ICO's opinion on the matter, just taking clinical matters aside for a second, the ICO's opinion on the matter would also be that you would need to have the appropriate kind of data protection provisions in place. So you would need to document this. You need to have a retention schedule for the clinical information that is separate to everything else. The information probably needs to be stored more securely and more separately to everything else, because it could be that, for example, payroll need access to the payroll information, but they don't need access to the medical information. So you would need to segment it. Lots of HR software does that for you, but you would need to have those considerations. So it's not a hard no. I'm not saying that what you would be doing there is fundamentally wrong, Helen, but there are definitely risks associated to it. So you just need to be aware of those risks, both from a clinical point of view and a data protection point of view. And I think if the ICO did question you about it, they would probably have an opinion about it. So yes, it's probably the quick answer to your question, in my view. I'm thinking about those people who are doing just fine. Thanks, Harry. Sorry, it was quite long. Oh, no, it's okay. It's absolutely fine. No problem at all, Helen. Jamie, presumably you would tell us part of the report they are taking medication. So what's the difference between us gathering directly from we wouldn't tell you what medication. Occupational health would not tell you what medication, and it's not something you need to know. The one or two exceptions to that might be, let's say, if somebody is diabetic and needs to take insulin and they need to carry it around with them, we would probably inform you about that, because you might need to conduct, obviously it depends the working environment, but you might need to conduct a risk assessment to make sure the person has regular access to their insulin. For example, it's not stored in a locker that takes them half an hour to get to, or the same with an inhaler or an EpiPen or something along those lines. Mostly, if somebody is taking an antidepressant medication or a contraceptive pill or something like that, no, there is no need for you to know that information. There's need for occupational health to know that information because it's part of their assessment. There is no need for you to know that information. So no, that would not go on a report. Most of the time, a report effectively, as I kind of mentioned earlier, is answering two things. Are they fit for work? Do they need any support or adjustments? Leave it to the occupational health company to store all of that medical information, their medication, their health history, their health background, the responses to the questions, their symptoms, the fact that they were admitted to hospital 3 years ago, all of that. You don't need to know that. That's for the occupational health company to assess and store. So no, that's in answer to your question, Jamie, that's the difference, is that no, the report wouldn't tell you about the medication unless it was something specifically you needed to know about from a risk point of view, like carrying an EpiPen, for instance. I'm talking about, if they've got an allergy to something. Do you have an example of a report an employer will get? Of course I do, Belinda. Yes, I will. I'll send that to you separately after this. They're all. I can't speak for other OH providers, but from our point of view, they're all on our website. So I'll send you a link to our website. It's got them on. Um, Gosh, we've run really over on time. So a really massive thanks to those of you who have stayed the duration. I appreciate it was scheduled for 30 minutes. I seem utterly useless at keeping these things to 30 minutes. But similarly, I think it's really important to make sure kind of your questions are answered thoroughly, and hopefully we can evidence things as best we can as well. It's all very well me kind of sitting here and um, you know, saying, got to do this, got to do this, got to do this. But it's really good to understand the why, because you may actually also take a different view on it, which is fine. But if you at least understand the why, then you can make an evidence decision on what your approach to these matters is. But anyway, I really hope that was helpful. I love talking about this subject. It's something that I think there is a lot of very wayward advice about. So it's one of the reasons that we've put this session together, I think, to kind of clarify some of the guidance and some of the advice directly for you. So I really hope you found it helpful. And it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you again for joining, and I look forward to speaking to you all soon. Take care.